Wer streift heimlich Gewinne ein, wenn Regenwälder brennen, Flüsse vergiftet und Tiere ausgerottet werden? In Greenvestigativ, dem neuen True Crime Podcast zu Umweltverbrechen, gehen wir genau dieser Frage auf die Spur. Greenvestigativ. Wenn die Natur das Opfer ist, finden wir die Täter. Jetzt reinhören, überall, wo es Podcasts gibt.
Die Schlacht um Europa. Der Profil-Podcast zur Zukunft unseres Kontinents.
Willkommen bei einer neuen Folge unseres Podcasts Die Schlacht um Europa. Mein Name ist Robert Treichler. Bei mir ist wie immer Siobhán Geets. Hallo Siobhán.
Hallo Robert.
Wir haben in der allerersten Folge dieses Podcasts, den Sie hoffentlich gehört haben, nicht nur erklärt, worum es gehen soll, sondern wir haben auch ein Versprechen abgegeben, nämlich wir haben gesagt, wir wollen auf alle Fälle alle Seiten hören. Das Profil ist von der Tendenz her natürlich ein pro-europäisches Magazin. Uns interessiert aber, was die Gegner der Europäischen Union, die Gegner dieses Europa zu sagen haben. Und wir bemühen uns tatsächlich, Leute zu finden, die uns das authentisch erklären können. Und das ist gar nicht so leicht, denn wie sich zeigt, sind manche doch eher ein wenig scheu, wenn es darum geht, ihren Standpunkt zu vertreten. Und für diese Folge haben wir jetzt aber jemanden gefunden, und zwar nicht irgendjemanden. Und wir sind sehr froh, wen wir da gefunden haben. Es ist nämlich der Europa-Vertreter, also derjenige, der sich um Europa kümmert, innerhalb der Heritage Foundation.
Genau, Nile Gardiner heißt der Mann, der war auch schon mal in Österreich, hat für ein bisschen Aufruhr gesorgt, vergangenen August beim Forum Alpbach. Der vertritt sehr, europafeindliche Positionen. Also eigentlich findet er, die EU gehört abgeschafft und bezeichnet auch im Interview mit uns die Europäische Union als Basket Case, also als hoffnungsloser Fall. Also Europa als Irrer, den man irgendwie am besten abschaffen sollte.
Die Heritage Foundation muss man vielleicht kurz erklären. Das ist eine sehr einflussreiche Stiftung in den USA. Die gibt es seit den 70er Jahren, gegründet wurde sie 1973, ist eine konservative Stiftung, die im Wesentlichen die Werte der Republikanischen Partei vertritt. Nun hat sich die Republikanische Partei durchaus stark geändert im Laufe dieser Jahrzehnte, vor allem jetzt unter Trump. Und die Heritage Foundation hat sich aber mit der Partei geändert und ist ideologisch sehr stark Trump gefolgt, vertritt diese Make America Great Again Ideologie von Donald Trump.
Genau, also die Stiftung hat sich auch mit der Partei gemeinsam radikalisiert.
So kann man das formulieren. Und deswegen hat sie auch einen wirklich großen Einfluss. Also diese Heritage Foundation hat, als Trump nicht Präsident war, zwischen den beiden Amtszeiten, ein Programm ausgearbeitet, das doch relativ bekannt geworden ist, nämlich das Project 2025. Das war ein letztlich 900 Seiten starkes Papier, in dem dargelegt wurde, was eine neue Trump-Administration, wenn er wieder an die Regierung kommen sollte, und das ist ja der Fall jetzt, was die tun sollte, mit welchen Executive Orders, welche politischen Themen angegangen werden sollen. Das war sehr, sehr ausführlich, 900 Seiten, und hat Trump auch ermöglicht, von Tag 1 an sehr, sehr effektiv in seinem Sinn zu regieren.
Das ist ja ganz lustig, weil er hat am Anfang behauptet, als das rauskam, dass er das irgendwie gar nichts damit zu tun hat. Also Trump habe nichts mit dem Project 25 zu tun. Er hat dann aber eigentlich Schritt für Schritt so ziemlich alles befolgt, was da drin steht, eben vor allem in den präsidentialen Direktiven.
Und dieses Project 2025 war natürlich eine Blaupause für ein neues Amerika, wie man auch mehr Macht zum Präsidenten schieben kann. Genau das, was wir jetzt erleben. Und diese selbe Heritage Foundation, die arbeitet jetzt daran, auch in Europa ein Projekt umzusetzen. Und am Ende dieses Projekts steht wohl das Ende der Europäischen Union. Und warum ist jetzt diese Heritage Foundation auch in Europa möglicherweise einflussreicher, als man bisher annehmen würde? Weil sie mit europäischen Parteien zusammenarbeitet, und zwar vor allem mit den Parteien der patriotischen Fraktion im EU-Parlament. Das ist die Fraktion, zu der auch die FPÖ gehört und das Rassemblement National und Fidesz in Ungarn etc. Sie arbeiten aber auch mit anderen rechten Parteien, die nicht dieser Fraktion angehören, zusammen. Diesen Nile Gardiner haben wir um ein Interview gebeten und wir haben es bekommen, und es hat relativ lang gedauert. Wir haben recht lang mit ihm gesprochen. Es war auch durchaus lebhaft und wir werden es jetzt in diesem Podcast spielen und gelegentlich unterbrechen, um etwas zu erläutern.
Ja, hören wir rein.
The Heritage Foundation has a special interest in Europe, in the European Union. Last year, I think your president, the president of the Heritage Foundation, took part in a meeting of the parties of the patriotic group in Madrid. The slogan was "Make Europe Great Again." And your foundation is basically supporting this political group. What exactly does this support consist of?
Well, firstly, the Heritage Foundation doesn't provide any kind of assistance to political parties or groups in Europe. But what the Heritage Foundation does, it supports the drive, the momentum towards a Europe of nation states and sovereignty and self-determination in Europe as a policy goal. And it does not provide any direct assistance to any political parties in Europe. But what it does do, it supports the overall goal of a Europe based upon sovereignty and self-determination. And that's closely in alignment, I think, with where the US administration is today. And President Trump has been very vocal in his views on the European Union. And President Trump views the EU as increasingly adversarial for the United States. The Trump administration's view is that the US would be better working with a collection of nation states in Europe rather than a supranational European Union. And so here at Heritage, we're in very close alignment with where the US administration is with regard to the big picture on Europe. Actually, what happens in Europe, of course, the future of Europe will be decided by Europeans themselves. But the United States has a clear national interest in supporting ideologically and as a matter of principle, and also US policy, supporting a Europe that is based upon the nation state and not upon EU supranationalism. So this is a big change, of course, from where the Biden administration was and the Obama administration. Both of them were Euro-federalist backers of the European project. The present US administration is not. And this is a big change of approach.
Die Positionen, die Gardiner und die Heritage Foundation vertreten, die kommen ja bei der ersten Antwort schon sehr klar raus. Und zu Beginn kommt er auch dann auf eines seiner Herzensanliegen zurück, den Brexit. Also den erwähnt er dann im Laufe des Interviews immer wieder, nämlich als positives Beispiel, also als Vorbild, wie man es machen soll und wie es auch andere Staaten in Europa machen werden, wenn es nach Gardiner geht. Da muss man ein bisschen einordnen. Also er kommt eigentlich aus Großbritannien, der ist Brite, das hört man ihm auch nach ein paar Jahrzehnten in den USA immer noch ein bisschen an. Und er hat an den Elite-Universitäten Yale und Oxford Geschichte studiert. Und dann direkt nach dem Studium hat er die ehemalige britische Premierministerin Margaret Thatcher beraten, als sie ihr Buch geschrieben hat mit dem Titel Statecraft, Strategies for Changing the World. Das ist dann 2002 erschienen. Also da muss er noch sehr jung gewesen sein. Und unmittelbar danach, also nachdem das Buch erschienen ist, ist er dann zur Heritage Foundation schon gestoßen in Washington. Und ein paar Jahre später, nämlich 2006, da wurde er dann Chef der Europa-Abteilung, also steile Karriere innerhalb dieses Think Tanks. Und diese Europa-Abteilung, die heißt auch Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom.
Ich glaube, man kann sagen, die politische Entwicklung die im Brexit kulminiert hat Gardiner natürlich vorweggenommen. Er war immer schon ein Gegner der Europäischen Union.
Genau.
Wie wir wissen, war auch Thatcher sehr kritisch gegenüber der Europäischen Union. Gardiner lehnt diese im Wesentlichen ab und er freut sich natürlich unglaublich, dass die geschichtliche Entwicklung ihm da nachkommt und gleichzeitig entgegenkommt.
Genau. Also als es dann 2016 soweit kam und sich die Briten in einem Referendum mehrheitlich für den EU-Austritt ausgesprochen haben, da war Gardiner wahrscheinlich begeistert. Und er hofft eben jetzt, dass andere Staaten dem Vorbild des Vereinigten Königreichs folgen werden. Und jetzt hören wir uns mal an, was er über die Sicht der aktuellen US-Regierung über den Brexit sagt.
This is also a very pro-Brexit US administration that believes that Brexit was a huge development in Europe that closely aligns with US national interests. And so this is where we are right now in Washington. I mean, we're looking forward to a different kind of Europe. Perhaps it will take 2 or 3 decades, but ultimately it's in America's national interest to have a Europe that is not based upon centralized power in Brussels. In fact, I was in Brussels just last week, and I think that Europe is far better off without the European Union, and that's my view. And I think the United States, is moving down that path in terms of its overall approach towards Europe.
Mm-hmm. You say you're not supporting political parties. I mean, by taking part in a meeting of political parties, you are of course supporting them. But are you supporting other institutions like think tanks or others?
Yeah, so we don't provide direct assistance to any political movement or party or think tank in Europe. The Heritage Foundation was based here in the United States. It's about advancing U.S. National interest. It does not have a direct involvement on the ground in European politics.
But you're cooperating, for instance, with the Hungarian think tank, the MCC, or with the Polish Ordo Juris?
Well, I mean, sometimes our experts will speak at events that are organized by these organizations in Europe. This is what think tank experts do. I mean, they speak at various events, across the Atlantic, and similarly, you have a lot of European experts who will speak at events hosted by Washington think tanks. So this is something that has gone on, of course, in terms of transatlantic cooperation for many decades, and I think this is common. This is common practice, and of course we have much in ground with a number of think tanks in Europe that advance a sovereignty-based Eurosceptic agenda, actually. And so, so the Heritage Foundation is the leading force in Washington in support of sovereignty and self-determination in Europe, and that in my view is a big positive. And we look forward to a very different Europe several decades from now. Brexit is just the beginning, I think, of fundamental changes across Europe. It's a huge game changer. And we believe that, Brexit has fundamentally altered the overall political landscape across Europe and will continue to do so.
Robert, das müssen wir jetzt erklären. Also du hast den Ordo Juris angesprochen, das ist ein Think Tank aus Polen und auch den ungarischen MCC. Die beiden stehen ja mit der Heritage Foundation in Kontakt, aber wie genau und was wollen diese Think Tanks überhaupt?
Also was sowohl die Heritage Foundation als auch dieses Matthias Corvinus-Kollegium, das von der ungarischen Regierung unter Viktor Orban unterstützt wird, und auch das polnische Ordo Juris Institute. Was die alle wollen, ist ein Europa der Nationalstaaten. Ein Ende dieses supranationalen, also dieses übernationalen, dieser Institutionen der Europäischen Union. Die wollen sie loswerden. Sie wollen ein Europa, in dem mehr oder weniger nur noch die Nationalstaaten das Sagen haben. Und dann ist die Frage, wie kommen wir dorthin? Dieses MCC und das Ordo Juris Institut, die haben gemeinsam ein Programm geschrieben und veröffentlicht. Das heißt The Great Reset, also der große Neuanfang oder das große auf Null stellen, wenn man so will. Und der Untertitel ist die dringende Notwendigkeit einer drastischen EU-Reform. EU-Reform, da steckt es jetzt schon drinnen, es ist etwas anderes als der Austritt. Das heißt, die haben sich überlegt, wie könnte man aus dieser EU etwas anderes machen und sind darauf gekommen, also entweder natürlich, man legt alles flach, man macht Tabula rasa und man erfindet einen neuen Pakt zwischen den Nationalstaaten und der basiert im Wesentlichen darauf, dass man keine Institution mehr hat, abseits des Gremiums, in dem sich die nationalen Regierungen treffen, das irgendwas zu sagen hat. Es dürfen keine EU-Rechte mehr über den nationalen Verfassungen stehen. Es darf der Europäische Gerichtshof nicht mehr über den nationalen Gerichten stehen. All das haben sie sich überlegt, wie man das machen könnte. Und dem entgegen stünde jetzt das, was Gardiner meint, der Brexit, also die Austrittsideen. Also wenn Frankreich austritt, ist die EU erledigt. Wenn Deutschland austritt, ist die EU erledigt. Oder aber man versucht das so, wie die sich das ausgedacht haben, mit einem Great Reset und man gründet eine neue Europäische Union. Die heißt dann übrigens auch anders, die hieße dann die Europäische Gemeinschaft der Nationen.
We also have a Eurosceptic party in Austria, the EVP, so with the Freedom Party. So from a moral and ideological perspective, you would be supporting them in Austria, in our country?
Well, let me say this. I mean, there are a very wide range of political parties and movements on the right in Europe. Each of these parties is different, and our approach is to support the overall big picture, which is that we support the drive towards greater sovereignty and self-determination in Europe. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't directly provide any assistance to any political party or movement in Europe, but we will certainly work with our allies in Europe who share a belief in strong transatlanticism. We will work with those parties in Europe who actually advance a pro-American approach and who also believe in sovereignty, self-determination in Europe. But
and that would be FPÖ in Austria. Are you in touch with them? Are you in contact with the Freedom Party?
Well, I've not directly myself, but I do think that a lot of the goals advanced by this political party with regard to the future of Europe are similar goals to those shared among many in Washington who want to see a Europe of sovereign nation states, and so. But the reality is that there are a multitude of parties on the right in Europe. Some of them are part of the Patriots group, some are part of the ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformists. And the United States will work with those who advance a pro-transatlantic approach, those who advance sovereignty, self-determination in Europe. That's in the U.S. national interest, and there will be, I think, growing engagement between conservatives in Washington and a range of political parties in Europe. But ultimately, of course, the future of Europe will be decided by Europeans themselves. But the United States has a clear national interest in helping to shape the future of Europe so that we have a Europe that is not hostile towards the United States, that we have a Europe that is not shackled to the centralized power of Brussels and the European Commission.
Mm-hmm. You say that Brexit is sort of a model for other states as well. Why do you think the patriotic parties are not demanding referendums on an exit of their respective country? And when they're in power, they are not promising a referendum on this question?
Well, that's a good question, and that should be asked of them. But I expect that there will be more referendums held in Europe in the course of the next 10 to 20 years, and I think that's inevitable. And right now, I think that Eurosceptic parties are focused upon trying to reform the European Union. In my view, that is not going to succeed. I don't think the EU can be reformed. But that's where I think most parties are on the right at this time. The Conservative Party in Britain, of course, had the same approach previously. And we saw that with David Cameron, for example, who did not support Brexit. He attempted to have I think a new kind of relationship between the UK and the European Union while the UK stayed in the EU. Now, clearly, that approach was never going to succeed. And I think also the calls from various parties on the right in Europe to reform the EU, while I understand their approach, I think that these parties would be better off campaigning to leave the European Union, because you can't really reform the EU. I think it's unreformable, and the EU is not it's not really accountable, frankly. Well, the European Commission isn't accountable, I think, to nation states. It behaves like a dictatorship, and you can't reform a dictatorship, which is why the British people left the EU.
The fact is that ever since the Brexit referendum, most other also right-wing parties refrained from demanding a referendum because they just simply would not win it. So they're not asking for it anymore.
Well, I think it will take some time before public opinion shifts in European countries towards a Brexit-style exit from the EU. And I think that we're not there yet in most European countries, but I think that Europe is moving down that direction. After all, let's not forget that the idea of Brexit, even in 2010, was regarded as completely unrealistic. And when my former boss, Margaret Thatcher, wrote a book called Statecraft, which was released in 2002, she spoke about a British future potentially outside of the European Union. And at that time, this was regarded as completely unrealistic. And so you fast forward to 2016, and even then, almost the entire political establishment was against Brexit. Most of the media was against Brexit, and Brexit was seen by most pollsters as unrealistic. But the Brexit campaign succeeded and was victorious against all odds. Now, can this happen in countries such as France, for example, Netherlands, Scandinavian nations, Austria eventually? Yes, it could happen, but we have to be patient, and it will take place, I think, eventually. And in Brussels last week, I made a prediction before an audience of European commissioners and officials of the EU would ultimately collapse in the course of the next 20, 30, 40 years. And I stand by that prediction. I do think the EU will not last in the long term. No experiment like this has ever succeeded in history. And any attempt, I think, to control the whole of Europe, and we've seen that from the likes of Hitler in the past, Stalin and dictators in Europe previously have tried to control, Napoleon have tried to control all of Europe. This will never succeed, actually, and this goes against the grain of history. And national sovereignty will always triumph, I think, over supranationalism. And the EU is a huge experiment.
Are you comparing the European Union to Stalinism and National Socialism by Hitler?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of what Hitler and Stalin and Napoleon were trying to achieve, the conquering of Europe, I think that ideologically there are some clear similarities with what some individuals in Brussels want to achieve, which is the control of Europe, actually. We're not talking about, the mass murder of millions or tens of millions of people, which was ultimately part of Hitler's project and Stalin's approach as well. We're not talking about that, but ideologically, if you're looking at a group of individuals who seek to control the future of Europe and behave like dictators, this has never succeeded in the past. And I've no reason to believe the European Union is going to survive half a century from now, because nothing like this has ever succeeded in history. And the European Union is increasingly about power and centralized control. And I do think that there are similarities certainly between the EU and the Soviet Union. And all of those in the past who have tried to unify Europe and control it have failed spectacularly. And those include, of course, Hitler, Napoleon, and Stalin.
Okay, but you are aware that Hitler, Napoleon, and Stalin conquered Europe, whereas the way the European Union got together is by the free will of these nation states and their populations and their governments.
I'm well aware of that because, of course, the British people and the American people liberated Europe from Nazi tyranny and also stood up, of course, to Stalin and the Soviet Union. And my former boss, Margaret Thatcher, played a key role, of course, in bringing down the Soviet Empire. So I'm well aware of that. And what I'm talking about here is an EU that is increasingly dictatorial in style.
But what exactly do you mean? I mean, it works based on a treaty, and that treaty has been decided by the nation states, by the national governments, by the European Parliament, and by the Commission. What
form of direct democracy is there in Europe? There doesn't exist, actually. The European Commission is not elected. I mean, who voted for Ursula von der Leyen to be supreme leader of the EU? I mean, no one did, actually. And so, what I'm saying to you is that what you think is normal in Europe for example, to the American people, it comes across as completely insane. And this is why the British people voted to leave the European Union, because they wanted to have their own freedom and sovereignty. Now, you can argue about whether or not Brexit has been fully implemented as best as it can, but the reality is the British people had enough of the EU and being told what to do. And why should the British people, who played a key role in liberating Europe from tyranny, listen to unelected bureaucrats sitting in Brussels telling them what to do? So I hope you understand why the British people voted for Brexit. And what you are seeing in Europe, of course, is a rise of Eurosceptic parties. As you point out, of course, these parties are not yet calling for an exit from the European Union. Could they do so in the next 10 to 20 years? Absolutely, yes. And let's not forget. Let's not forget. I mean, the idea of Brexit in the UK, even 15 years ago, was dismissed by the entire political establishment as completely unrealistic. And so the pace of change in Europe today is incredibly fast. And we are seeing,
but even a country like Hungary is not trying to exit.
No, I've met with large numbers of Hungarian officials, and I've always said to them that they should be thinking about leaving the European Union. But the response, of course, is always the same response you receive from many governments, Eastern and Central Europe, that they are, of course, reliant upon subsidies from the European Union. They gain, of course, from the financial relationship. There is, of course, I think within Eastern and Central Europe a continuing dependence upon the EU, and that's the way the EU operates, of course. But this dependence will eventually end. There's no doubt about it, and I think a time will come when these countries like Hungary, Poland, for example, see that the benefits of being part of the European Union are outweighed by the benefits of leaving the EU. And I think this will happen in countries right now that, of course, receive a lot of subsidies from the EU. But that will change as they become wealthier.
Austria, for instance, ever since it became a member of the European Union, has been paying more than it receives. But there's no majority in Austria who wants to exit the EU, even though we're paying more than we.
Yeah, I mean that's your decision.
Is that an indication that people are quite happy with it?
That's your decision. Austrian people also have not supported membership of the NATO alliance, which I think is astonishing, because once those Russian tanks start pouring into Austria, then I think perhaps Austrian people might rethink their opposition to joining NATO. So I disagree with the stance Austria is taking on the EU and NATO. Austria should be in NATO. It should be out of the European Union. But that's an issue for the Austrian people themselves to decide.
Exactly.
It's their own decision.
But this is my question. You say it's up to the Austrian people or to the Hungarian people, etc. And I remember that you were very critical when former President Barack Obama advised the British people to vote to remain in the European Union. You heavily criticized him in that moment. And now, because you said there's no need to lecture the British public,
on how to vote. But isn't that exactly what you and the US government are doing now? You're trying to lecture the European people on how they should organize the political life.
President Obama intervened directly in a British vote in a referendum, and I don't believe that a U.S. president should be intervening directly in a referendum, actually. And so that's the first point I'd make. I think secondly, the United States administration has an overall right to advance what it views as the U.S. national interests. I don't believe the United States should intervene directly in elections or referendums in Europe. This is what Obama did. But Obama had every right as president to express his views about U.S. policy towards Europe. Obama was a Euro-federalist. He expressed those views. I don't believe he had the right as president to be intervening in a direct referendum in the UK. That was wrong. Now, looking back upon it, I think that Obama's intervention actually helped the Brexit side. And in that way, Brexiteers have also thanked Obama for actually helping their cause by making comments that actually got a lot of British people out to vote. So there's a lot of risk when you intervene in a referendum and a vote. I don't think it's ever a good idea for the United States to intervene in a European election, and it's not a good idea for European politicians to be intervening in U.S. elections either. And we saw plenty of U.S.
Sorry. Is that also true when members of the U.S. government support Viktor Orban in the upcoming elections?
Well, I don't see the U.S. officials going to Budapest and telling Hungarian people how to vote in their election. I mean, I don't think you've seen anything like what Obama did when he appeared alongside David Cameron in the press box.
It just happened. Marco Rubio went straight from Munich to Budapest to support Viktor Orban in
Marco Rubio didn't say, you've got to vote for Orban in the election. I must have missed that. I didn't see that. Do you have the exact quote? I didn't actually see that. Obama intervened directly in the referendum just weeks ahead of the referendum, and so that I think is a fundamental difference, actually.
No, but I think Marco Rubio was well understood in Budapest. But what it really comes down to is the USA administration telling Europe what to do exactly. So consequently, should Europe bend the knee every time a new US president comes along? And should we then behave or organize our continent according to the wishes of the US administration? Is that the idea? Because in 4 years, it might be someone else.
I think, European governments can do what they want to do, but the reality is that the United States guarantees the security of Europe. And I can assure you, if the United States withdrew from Europe and pulled its 70,000 troops out of Europe, and if the US ended its security guarantees from Europe, the Russians would pour into Eastern Europe tomorrow, actually. And they'll be heading towards not just Eastern Central Europe, they'll be heading towards Berlin, Paris, and also Vienna as well. And so
you better do what we say or else.
The reality is, look, if European governments want to do whatever they want to do, take care of their own security, I say good luck to them. But we're not living that reality. And so the United States has bankrolled the security of Europe for several decades. And yes, the US has a right to actually weigh in on what happens in Europe in terms of the overall big picture. And the US has the right to condemn the European Commission as a tyranny. And the US has the right to stand up for freedom of speech in Europe and outflank European governments on this. Is doing this with the UK with regard to Keir Starmer. And Starmer's government has arrested thousands of British citizens for their social media commentary, which would be, so Keir Starmer's arresting people in the UK for comments that would be protected freedom of speech in the United States, right? So the US actually has a right to defend US tech platforms such as X operating in the UK. Yes, it does. And if European governments do not like the US standing up for what it sees as the principles of sovereignty, freedom, and self-determination, well, let's see Europe defending itself against the Russians. I don't think that's a reality. I think you know that. I mean, your country's not even in NATO. But your expectation would be if the Russians poured into Austria, who would come to throw the Russians out? Actually, it would be the United States. It would not be anyone else in Europe who could do that.
I don't quite understand why you're trying to link the defense of Europe with a democratic decision how to organize the political life in Europe. I mean, it was a democratic decision to join the EU. It was in Austria. It was a referendum. The government was for it, and ever since, people had not felt the urge to leave it. And the European Commission actually is not a dictatorship. The European Commission they're being appointed by the European Council, so the national. The representatives of the national government.
Let me ask you.
To be voted for by the European Parliament.
Who sets all the regulations? Who sets all the regulations that apply to Austria in almost every aspect of life? It's the European Commission, isn't it? Right. How many Austrians voted for the European Commission? Who sets your trade policy? Do you set it? No, you don't. Actually, you're not a free country.
The European Commission has to be voted by the European Parliament, and these are the people who we directly voted for. Excuse me.
How many Austrians are directly voted for the European Commission? Zero.
How did Theresa May, Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak become Prime Minister?
Well, that's the British political system.
Do the British have the right to organize
that,
it this way? Yeah. Is it democratic or is it not?
Yeah, of course. Of course, the British people have the right to decide their own political system.
It's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. It is the European Parliament that decides that this is the Commission, and the European Parliament is voted for by the general public.
You have no direct say over what happens in Brussels yourself.
Well, right? Nobody has a direct say as an individual, of course.
Distinction between the United States, which does have direct democracy, and what you have in the European Union. It's night and day, the difference. You can't compare in any way the US and the EU, nor can you compare the UK with the European Union.
It's hard to compare.
It's entirely
that, but of
different,
course,
actually.
A member state of the European Union has a lot more rights than a state of the United States, obviously.
Well, states are not sovereign countries in the United States, all right? And the European Union is not the United States of Europe. Actually, you're dealing with individual European countries. States are not sovereign nations, right?
Right.
This is the difference between the US
European
and
Commission
the EU.
cannot decide anything by itself. It needs the votes of the European Parliament. And for instance, the Green New Deal, which you probably despise, I presume so.
Yeah.
But
it's awful.
Well,
but if you want to have it,
and
that's
apparently not only the Commission wanted it, but also the European Parliament wanted it, and also the European Council, which is the collective European nations, they also wanted it.
Also ich glaube, wir merken schon in diesem Interview, er hat eine sehr emotionale Haltung gegenüber der EU, also sehr ablehnend emotional.
Er ist absolut überzeugt, dass die Europäische Union schädlich ist. Ja.
Ja, und dass man die so schnell wie möglich abschaffen muss. Und damit ist er einer Meinung mit US-Präsident Trump. Der hat ja schon vor Jahren einmal behauptet, die EU sei gegründet worden, um Amerika zu schaden.
Das hat er vor allem auf die wirtschaftliche Situation bezogen und auch darauf, dass sich Europa quasi ein wenig gratis von den USA verteidigen lässt. Mittlerweile ist das aber gereift zu einem wirklichen ideologischen Programm. Wir haben das gesehen in der nationalen Sicherheitsstrategie, wo drinnen steht, Europa ist im Verfall und man muss die Opposition stärken, die in Europa angeblich unterdrückt wird, etc. Das ist ein ganzes Gebäude, weshalb die Europäische Union schädlich sei und weg muss. Das ist das, was Trump sagt, schreibt, und das beruht auf diesen Gedanken, die Gardiner ausführt.
Und das ist aber eine relativ neue Entwicklung. Also für Gardiner muss das erfreulich sein, diese Entwicklung. Endlich ist sozusagen das im Weißen Haus angekommen, für das er seit Jahrzehnten arbeitet. Er leitet ja seit 20 Jahren schon die Europaabteilung der Heritage Foundation und musste lange warten. So, und jetzt ist es soweit. Und Gardiner glaubt auch nicht daran, dass sich das jemals wieder ändern wird. Also er glaubt nicht, dass eine zukünftige andere US-Administration die Haltung, was Europa betrifft, wieder ändern wird, sondern er denkt, Amerika ist endlich aufgewacht.
Okay, but it is a relatively new phenomenon that a US administration is so heavily critical towards the European Union. I mean, throughout the decades, the US presidents have supported the European Union. There's never been a demand to destroy the European Union.
Well, I think, I mean, you make an interesting point. I've written articles about this. I think President Trump is the first Eurosceptic American president. Is he going to be the last? No. I mean, I expect that Euroscepticism is going to continue, especially if there's going to be a Republican administration. But I think even on the Democrat side, I mean, I think thinking will shift on this, and you're going to see a much more of a kind of America first approach, even from the Democrats as well. But if you're talking about Republican presidents, whoever succeeds Donald Trump, I think, will have the same approach to Europe, whether that's Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance or any Republican figure. And the EU is viewed as a basket case, I mean, frankly, by US conservatives. It doesn't matter whether it's Donald Trump or another Republican figure. And it's relatively new. I think that Brexit was a very big influence, a big game changer in terms of how the US approaches the EU. And US conservatives are very pro-Brexit. They're very supportive of Brexit. And they don't like what the EU represents, which is big government, socialism, centralized power, the Green New Deal, suppression of freedom of speech. I mean, all of this is anathema to US conservatives. So you can see why the United States is moving towards a more Eurosceptic path. And now I know in Austria that, and I was in Austria last August, and I think the way of thinking among many Austrians is very different to that of the United States. And I respect that. That's up to the Austrian people to decide. But I hope that Austrians will respect how increasingly large numbers of Americans view the European Union. It's a very different approach.
Because you keep getting back to free speech. I have a question about that. Viktor Orban, who's one of the people you want to support, one of the political forces you want to support in Europe, he has banned the Pride Parade from taking place in Budapest. Isn't that problematic at all, or isn't that part of freedom of speech to go on the street?
There's a difference between
a party.
Orban was government's banned Pride Parade. They have every right to do so, to defend their own cultural values. But you're not seeing this is not a free speech issue.
That does not worry you?
All right, no one's being banned from speaking freely in Hungary or Poland or so on these issues. No one is being banned from speaking out on social media platforms. No one's being arrested. But the government has the right to ban what it views as as political marches and so on, if it deems that necessary, yes. But it's not arresting people, throwing people in jail for expressing their views on these issues. This is a fundamental difference. So yes, freedom of speech is fully protected in Hungary and Poland and countries that take a more traditional approach on cultural matters. People are not being thrown in jail here.
Speech?
And yes, governments have the right to decide whether political, marches and so on, these pride marches, are allowed or not on the streets of their cities.
How's pride political?
Yes, it is.
How?
Absolutely. Which is why the Trump administration has barred any sort of pro-LGBT, statements being made by. So yes, it is a political matter, actually. It's a matter of the defense of traditional family values. Yeah.
But all these instances you're claiming haven't been done by the European Union. This is whatever you say about Great Britain. This has got nothing to do with the European Union.
I do think that Look, the EU is
This is the
actively
nation state that's
moving
involved.
to try and shut down X. The fines that have been issued against Elon Musk's X recently are an example of an attack on freedom of speech. I mean, I've been very vocal about this. It is about freedom of
That's got
speech,
nothing to
actually,
do with freedom of speech.
because X is the biggest platform in the defense of freedom of speech in Europe today.
But the fines you're talking about probably have got nothing to do with free speech. Those fines were not about some
That's
content
what you say,
that
but
was
here in the
published.
United States, it's viewed as an attack on freedom of speech. The US government doesn't fine social media.
No, but
the US government doesn't fine social media platforms, actually. And so, I say to you, when large fines are applied against platforms such as X, viewed very differently, which is why the Trump administration has strongly condemned this.
Okay, but how is it viewed in Washington when the Federal Communications Commission considered revoking the broadcast licenses of ABC after the comment of Jimmy Kimmel on the death of Charlie Kirk?
Well, actually, have they revoked these licenses? No, they've not. And there's been a huge, intense public debate over this. And we've not seen any licenses.
Did it worry you?
And so, you're talking here about, it's hypothetical, but there are no licenses have been actually revoked, and no action has been taken to do so.
What about the warning letter to Apple by the Federal Trade Commission, alleging potential bias in Apple News, suggesting they treat conservative sources unfairly? Is that an infringement of the freedom of?
Well, I think what that is all about is actually calling for an objective approach to the news here, and I don't think you can compare what the EU is doing with calls for objective reporting in the United States, and no U.S. news organizations have been shut down or anything like that. So I think free speech is 100% protected here.
But no media has been shut down in Europe. Which media has been shut down in Europe?
Well, you have seen actually in some European countries journalists actually being threatened with prosecution. I mean, you see in all EU nations, you do see individuals who have been prosecuted actually for what would be protected freedom of speech in the United States. What is deemed to be hate language or so on in Europe is protected freedom of speech in the United States. And there's a fundamental difference.
Look like once you've succeeded in shattering the European Union altogether, what is this going to look like? Will it just be in the sovereign nation states and that's it?
I mean, I hope that will be the future for Europe as sovereign nation states that works closely together, and you don't need the EU actually to have a successful, vibrant, wealthy, prosperous Europe. In fact, I think that the EU actually represents decline, and why not have a Europe that is based upon purely sovereign nation states? Will we see that ultimately happening? Yes, I think we will. But it will take many decades before we reach there. I do believe that ultimately, the EU will crumble. What that would take would be a major European nation at the heart of Europe, for example, France or Germany, potentially leaving the EU. And I think we could see that in France, where there is significant Euroscepticism. There's not a majority in France yet to leave the EU. Could that be the case 5-10 years from now? Yes, but it would take, I think, a country like France to leave the European Union to bring about the end of the EU. Could that happen? Absolutely, yes.
Das war unser Gespräch mit Nile Gardiner von der Heritage Foundation. Ich fand es sehr interessant, mit ihm zu debattieren. Was meinst du, Siobhán?
Ja, auch. Sehr, ja.
Es ist ein wirklich konträrer Standpunkt und ich finde, er verteidigt ihn auch sehr wortgewandt.
Ja, und ich finde es auch interessant, dass er Dinge fordert und wünscht, die man in Europa so eigentlich nicht hört. Also nicht einmal von den äußerst rechten Parteien, wie du ja auch gesagt hast im Interview, die fordern das nicht, zum Beispiel einen EU-Austritt. Also es sind extreme Positionen. Er sagt ja auch öfter, ja, wir sehen das in Amerika anders. Ja, ich glaube, wir in Europa sehen das auch ganz anders als er. Und das kommt, finde ich, in dem Interview gut rüber.
Ich glaube, unsere Rechtsparteien in Europa sind natürlich pragmatischer, die sehen, was ist möglich,
Natürlich.
wo haben wir eine Chance, eine Mehrheit zu bekommen und wo nicht und passen sich dementsprechend an. Umso besser ist es, jemanden ungefiltert zu bekommen. Ich hoffe, es hat Sie auch interessiert. Das war für Sie aufschlussreich, liebe Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer. Und ich bedanke mich auch bei unserem Techniker, Producer Matthias Hofer, der Nile Gardiner auch seine Stimme geliehen hat, diesmal für die deutsche Übersetzung.
Sollten Sie Fragen haben, Anregungen, dann schreiben Sie uns.
Meine Mailadresse lautet treichler.robert@profil.at. Und ich hoffe, Sie abonnieren die Sendung, wo immer es Podcasts gibt und bleiben uns treu. Danke.
Danke fürs Zuhören. Danke für Ihre Zeit. Qualitätsjournalismus braucht Unterstützung. Abonnieren Sie uns. Unser Magazin, digital oder print, unsere Newsletter. Hören Sie unsere Podcasts. Wir freuen uns übrigens auch über exklusive Infos. Auch das brauchen wir, um zu überleben.